I think kind of makes sense to structure it that way. And just before getting started, so I don't forget, I'm just going to put my email in the chat in case there's any questions after the presentations. If anyone wants to follow up after this evening, feel free to send me an email. All right, so just share my screen. Jeff, does that look good? Awesome. All right. So first, I'm going to talk about tenant associations 101. Basically, trying to get a tenant association started in your building, getting things up off the ground. I mean, I'm going to talk about tenant associations. I know, use different words. They might just talk about organizing in a building. They might talk about having a building committee, any kind of organization in your building. I think, if you got that, then you've got a tenant association, even if you're not, calling it as such. Basically, a tenant association is just a way for tenants to work collectively to improve conditions and address issues in our buildings. The reason why we've organized together, it's pretty simple. There's a huge power imbalance between a landlord and a tenant, especially the case when you have, REITs and large corporate landlords, but even, a landlord who might own one triplex or 112-unit building, they got a lot of money, they have a lot of power, they're able to hire property managers, hire lawyers to take care of things. There's a huge power imbalance. So as tenants, when we come together as a group, it helps kind of correct that power imbalance, and that we could build our power as tenants. I saw a question in the chat. I don't know, I can't promise I'll do this throughout the whole presentation. But yes, everything that I'm going to say could apply also to community housing. But if there are specific questions about that, we can handle it in the Q&A. So, as tenants, I think we know a lot of the issues that we face, a lot of the issues that push us to organize. It could be, I'm not going to read the whole list, but, disrepair, poor maintenance, pest. Often we experience disrespect from management that gives us inaccurate information, incomplete information, tries to bully us into getting rid of air conditioners, stuff like that. We're all dealing, I think, with very high rent. And if we don't have high rent right now, then we're dealing with displacement pressures because our landlords want to get rid of us in order to raise the rent. So these are the types of issues that, we're facing that often, I think, push us to form tenant associations, but also these are the types of issues that we could, organize around and try to address through a tenant association. If you're trying to get, repairs done in your unit, I think a common experience people have, for example, is, reaching out to property management, putting a maintenance request in through the portal that your landlord wants you to use, stuff like that, or even calling your landlord up, calling property management. It's very easy for your landlord to ignore you, if you're just one person reaching out. But when tenants act together, it's much harder for them to ignore us. So that's one, I think, way that, we really show our strength in numbers. But even just sharing information is something that, increases our strength as tenants, helps us build power. Sometimes, a landlord might try to take advantage of certain tenants who might not know their rights, who might not know what the rules are around fees, around rent increases, around eviction. When tenants kind of are organized, when they're in communication with each other, they're able to protect each other, keep each other safe. And it does, have an impact in building the overall power in the building. Often when tenants are facing displacement pressures, the more older tenants who stick together, the more long-term tenants who stay in the building, who stay in their homes, the stronger you're going to be as an organization. So sharing information could be really useful for ensuring that people aren't displaced, aren't taken advantage of, aren't pushed around. And at the end of the day, that makes sure that, you have a stronger organization in the building. And I think one thing that's important to keep in mind that we often forget is that, as one tenant, you pay your rent, but as all the tenants in the building, you pay the bills for your landlord, which gives you a lot of power. I think there's an analogy with debt. One person who owes some money to the bank has control over you. But if you own billions of dollars to a bank, you have control over the bank. You could use that as leverage, even if you owe them money, or in some sense they're in a position of power in a certain respect. Because of that financial clout, you're able to negotiate terms that might be more favorable to you. So even if the landlord owns the building, they still depend on our rent to pay their bills, to fund their lifestyle. And that gives us a lot of power as tenants, if we're working together or acting collectively. So tenant association, it's by tenants for tenants. It's made up of tenants in the building. It's not made up of organizers. It's not politicians. It's not people outside the building. It's just tenants in the building. Doesn't need to be everyone in the building, but it's going to be made up of tenants in the building. And it's tenants in the building who decide what the issues are, what the priorities are, what actions to take to address these issues, and what activities they want to organize. So it's really by and for tenants in the building. And that's it. It's not any more complicated than that. It's literally just a group of tenants in a building coming together, organizing together to build their power, confront the landlord as a group, address issues, and so on. It's really not more complicated than that. It's about people in a building coming together so that they could make plans and take action together. And I think, especially when you're getting started, it's really useful to kind of think of it in these simple terms. It's really just coming together as a group so that you could do things together. The key is going to be communication. So creating and maintaining communication between tenants so that you could make plans and take action together. This is something we could talk about in the Q&A if there's questions about, ways that tenants could best stay in touch. It's going to vary by building, but it's something that I think a lot of people when they're getting started aren't sure about. But that's really important. Early on, you're going to want to establish lines of communication between tenants and maintain that communication so that you can do things together. This isn't, part of forming a tenant association, but it is important to know that your right to organize is protected by the Residential Tenancies Act. The landlord may try to interfere with your organizing. They may try to prevent you from organizing. You have the right to organize, and sometimes it could be important to make sure that your neighbors understand that, so people don't feel intimidated, and so that they feel encouraged to organize. And you have that right regardless of whether you call yourselves a tenant association. That doesn't matter. If you're organizing with your neighbors, you're a tenant association, and your right to do so is protected by the Residential Tenancies Act. So that's what you need, or kind of that's what a tenant association is. There's a lot of other things that you don't need, but that some tenant associations decide to do, or that some individuals are interested in. But it's important to know, I think, that you don't need these things. So there's no formal structure required. You don't need a president, a vice president, a treasurer, or anything like that. You don't need to have elections. Some tenant associations want to have elections. A lot of tenant associations or a lot of building committees don't have elections. You don't need to have any kind of registration, either for the members or for the tenant association. If you're living in Toronto, you do not need to register your tenant association with anybody. You don't need to incorporate. You don't need any kind of affiliations. You don't need a bank account. You don't have to fundraise. Again, some tenant associations might fundraise to start a food bank in their building, for example. That's something that you might decide to do, but it's not needed. There's no bank account that's needed. There's no authority that is needed to recognize your tenant association or grant it legitimacy. Certainly not your landlord. Again, this is something we could talk about in the Q&A, but a tenant association, thinking about it simply, is just something that you and your neighbors do. Just you and your neighbors coming together as a group to work together to address issues in your building. If you think about it that way, it's obvious that your landlord doesn't have to recognize you or respect you. Now, that might be an obstacle, or that might kind of encourage you to put a little bit more pressure on your landlord or to build your group to make it larger. Your legitimacy is going to come from having a lot of tenants in the building involved in the organizing, and from your collective actions that, you know, are able to achieve the outcomes that you want. Your landlord doesn't have to formally recognize you, and they might at first try to ignore the group, or, you know, try to you know, delegitimize it in the eyes of other tenants. But the responsibility falls onto the tenants to make sure that, you know, the work that you're doing almost basically forces the landlord to recognize you. And we could talk about this more in the Q&A if people have questions about this. It's sometimes a source of frustration that tenant associations, you know, a few people come together, they call themselves a tenant association, and the landlord basically ignores them. If that's happening, I'd take that as a sign that, you know, you're not yet at the point where you've, you know, you're not quite organized enough, you don't have quite enough power such that your landlord feels pressure to kind of recognize you. On that note, you don't need everyone in the building to be involved. You're going to want as many people as possible to be involved, but you don't need everyone to be involved. Often tenant associations start small. You know, even if you have 10% of the tenants in your building who are part of the group, that's a great start, and you can kind of grow from there. You do not need everyone involved in order to be considered the tenant association of the building. And you also, like I said earlier, do not need to call it a tenant association. You could call it a tenant union, you could call it a building committee, you could call it an organization of tenants at the building. You could call it whatever you want. Even though you don't need everybody, and you probably won't get everybody, at some point early on in the process, in order to, you know, get that legitimacy, you're going to want to invite everyone to join. You're not going to get everyone to join, and not everyone's going to want to join. But if you are claiming to be the tenant association of your building, you're at least going to want to extend that invitation to people, even if it's just slipping a flyer under every door to invite them to that initial meeting. At the very least, you know, it's important for the legitimacy of the organizing to invite everyone at least once. Also, early on, what you're going to want to do is figure out the best way for you and your neighbors to stay in touch, so that you can, you know, organize together, make plans, and take action together. And you are going to want maximum participation. Again, that doesn't mean everybody, but you're going to want as many people involved as you can, and you're going to want to try to grow the organizing as you kind of continue doing that work. In terms of getting started, you know, there's lots of different ways that people might try to form a tenant association. Sometimes people will pass out flyers. Sometimes people will put up posters around calling everyone to a meeting. You know, one way that people might start, or a good way to maybe get things off the ground, would just be talking to a few neighbors in the building. If you don't know anyone in the building, you know, people you see in the elevator, pass in the hallway, talking about issues in the building, seeing if people are interested in, you know, coming together as a group to try to address them. Sometimes, you know, people might just start on their own, just flyering, but it's often good to, you know, talk to neighbors, get a sense of, you know, how other people feel about the issues in the building. It's likely when it comes to things like maintenance, displacement pressures, the rent being too high, if you're experiencing those problems, then your neighbors likely are too. So talking to neighbors to get a sense of who might be involved in, you know, organizing and getting a tenant association started would be a good idea. Door knocking is really the best way to approach neighbors. That's something that you could do on your own. It could be, you know, knocking on all the doors on your floor to get started, see if anyone wants to join you. But, you know, like most things, doing it in a team is best. If you could find a neighbor who wants to start a tenant association, who's willing to door knock with you, that could be a good way to, you know, start building the group, start getting a sense of whether other people want to form a tenant association. And when you're door knocking initially, you know, it's often just to, you know, discuss issues, get a sense of whether people are interested in organizing, and collecting contact information to stay in touch, or to notify people about a meeting. So for example, when tenants are first starting to organize, they might say, okay, we're going to plan to knock on every door in the building once. You're not going to get everyone home, but at least start by doing that once. We're going to let people know that, we're tired of not getting maintenance done. See if they have maintenance issues, see if they're interested in organizing, and get a phone number. We'll let them know, and we're going to have a meeting. We're going to try to meet within the month. Something like that, some kind of plan for your door knocking. And we'll talk about that more in the next presentation or in the Q&A. But having those face-to-face conversations is really the best way to start connecting with neighbors, start getting a sense of people's interest in organizing, identifying other people who might want to be, involved in the organizing, and start building trust with your neighbors. So like I said, identifying other people. As you're door knocking, you could recruit other organizers. People, some people might not be interested in organizing at all. Some people might want to talk, but you get the sense that they themselves aren't too interested in being centrally involved. You might come across some people who, they think it's a great idea to form a tenant association and are really eager. And, you ask if they'd be interested in helping with the door knocking or helping to get things off the ground. Another thing you could do at the door when you're collecting contact information is figuring out the best way for you and your neighbors to stay in touch and share information. So, you know your neighbors better than anyone. You know the demographics, people's access to technology. As you're door knocking, ask people, what's the best way for us to stay in touch? Is it telephone? Do you have a cell phone? Is it a landline? Do you have WhatsApp on your phone? Do you have Facebook? Do you have email? Getting that information from your neighbors when you're doing that initial door knocking could help you decide what way is best for you and your neighbors to stay in touch. A few things I think are worth kind of keeping in mind, especially early on when you're trying to get a tenant association going, or it's kind of relatively new in the building. Typically, I'd suggest, not meeting unless you have to meet. I think, we're all very busy. We're working hard. If you're going to call a meeting early on and if you're organizing because you're trying to address serious issues in the building, then making sure that you're meeting for a purpose, not just in order to meet, I think is important. You don't want your neighbors to feel like, time's being wasted or that there's no agenda. So I'd say, make sure that you're meeting for a specific reason. So that might be, we're going to door knock in order to work up towards a first meeting to talk about getting organized. And then after that, you're going to be meeting for reasons to kind of plan next steps, to talk about something that happened, to debrief after a meeting, whatever it is, debrief after a meeting with management, for example. Whatever it is, when you're meeting, you want to have a reason to be meeting and you want to have an agenda. And another thing you're going to want to do is try to end your meetings with concrete plans for next steps. You want to maximize kind of the time that people are putting into it, and you want to maximize the utility of your meeting. So if you're having a meeting and you don't talk about next steps at the end or concrete next steps, then it's easy for things to kind of fizzle out and for days or weeks to pass without people really knowing what's going on. If you're having a meeting and you have people who took the time and who are there, once you've covered everything you want to cover on the agenda, make sure that you discuss, what are the next steps? Specifically, when are we going to meet next? Or when are we doing our action? Take advantage of the fact that people took the time to meet in order to kind of make those decisions. I think I covered some of this stuff already, but these are just, I think, a few tips or things to keep in mind when you're organizing. Like I said, door knocking is the best thing you could do. You might start door knocking to set up a tenant association, but then after that, you're going to door knock with a specific reason. So maybe you're collecting names on a demand letter. Maybe you're door knocking ahead of an action to try to pull people for an action. Door knocking takes a lot of work. It's worth that work, but you want to be door knocking with a specific reason. Similarly, you typically want to have a plan or a proposal when approaching neighbors or when you're having a meeting. So when you're door knocking, ignoring the kind of early door knocking where you're just trying to set up a tenant association, you might be pitching a specific action to tenants at the door or a specific plan, and you're door knocking in order to reach tenants who that you haven't yet spoken to about this plan. Likewise, if you're having a meeting, it's always best to kind of have something to propose. So related to the next point, it's common for there to be, a smaller group of tenants who are more involved in planning things in a tenant association or in a building. So one structure that often works is you might have a building committee or a smaller group that comes up with, some proposals or some plans that they then present to the whole building at a building meeting. And then at that meeting, it's not like you present kind of finalized plans that you're inflexible about, but you're offering something concrete. You're proposing something that, you've already thought about that makes sense in response to whatever issue you're facing. And the purpose of that building-wide meeting would be to evaluate the proposal, see who's available, who's interested in participating at that, or if people want to discuss it or maybe change the plan. But if you kind of show up to a meeting without a plan and you're just like, okay, so what are we going to do about this? That's a recipe for things to, I think, kind of stagnate. And people might also wonder why you're calling a meeting if you're not, presenting anything concrete. Again, that doesn't mean being inflexible. It doesn't mean, not having collective discussions or making collective decisions. But, it's often a good idea to have something prepared or something, to propose to people at a meeting or when door knocking, and to kind of get a sense of, what people's response is. Related to kind of actions, many actions you're going to want to have as much participation as possible. There's some actions that might not require it, or rare actions where you might not want it, but typically you're going to want as many tenants as possible to be participating. That means, as much as possible, planning actions at a time that people are going to be available. But then also, when you're having your meetings or when you're discussing those actions as a group, you want to get commitments from people. And then one thing that I think people early on might not think to do is following up with neighbors ahead of the action to remind them. If people want to talk about this in the Q&A or in the next presentation around, organizing campaigns, be happy to. But I think, just making a plan in a meeting, okay, in 2 weeks, Monday at 7, we're going to do this. And then you show up Monday at 7 in 2 weeks and not a lot of people are there. Things come up, people forget. So making a plan for, reminding neighbors, for polling people who maybe weren't at that meeting where it was discussed, to, divide up the tenant association list so that the building committee each calls 5 people a few days before the action to remind people. Coming up with a plan like that is a way to ensure maximum participation. Yeah, so just the last slide here about some tools. I already talked a little bit about, internal communication. So whether it's a WhatsApp group or a phone tree or some other kind of group chat or Facebook group, you're going to want to figure out a way to communicate amongst each other. But you might also want to figure out how to communicate as a tenant association with people outside of the tenant association. So for example, you might set up a tenant association email to communicate collectively with the landlord. So this is, it's not for one tenant to just log in and send a maintenance request, but this is for communication between the tenant association collectively and the landlord. You might want to set up a Facebook page, an Instagram account, or a Twitter account, so that you could communicate with the public. So that could be the public face of the tenant association. We could talk about that a little bit more, I think, in the next presentation. And another thing you could do, if you don't want to use your personal phone number, for example, there's apps like Fongo and others where you could set up a phone number for the tenant association, and you could have that on flyers when you're doing outreach and trying to connect with people that you're not already in touch with. Yeah, so that was kind of, setting up a tenant association, how to stay in touch with each other. And we'll talk about, campaigns and taking action next, but I've been talking for a long time, so let's get to some questions. All right. So, like we just discussed, organizing is really just making plans and taking action together. We do this to collectively improve conditions in our buildings, and address issues with our landlords. And we talked about how, communication between tenants is really the most important thing when you're getting started. You want to establish and maintain communication between members of the group. Now, I know tenant associations are going to do lots of things. You might mostly share information with each other. You might support each other in different ways. You might set up a food bank in the building. You might, like we discussed already, a tenant association is by and for tenants. It's up to you to decide what you want to do. And people will create tenant associations for various reasons, and different tenant association will engage in different kinds of activities. Now I'm going to focus mostly on, address how tenants can work together to address the types of issues that often motivate us to organize, like poor maintenance, above guideline rent increases, displacement pressure, eviction, stuff like that. And when we're thinking about these things, I think in some respects we could think of a lot of what tenant associations do, as a campaign to achieve some outcome. Tenants in a building might engage in successive campaigns over time, among the other things they do. But we could think about, the work of a group of organized tenants during a specific period as a campaign to address some issue or achieve some outcome. So like getting maintenance done, for example, or fighting off the evictions or whatever. So when it comes to campaign, there's three important elements that you're going to want to consider. One is going to be, what's the issue? So if you're having, trouble getting maintenance done and there's a lot of disrepair in the building, then that's the issue. And your demand is going to be related to that. Your demand is going to be to get our maintenance done. Your demand is going to be, we want the landlord to fix all the problems in our units. When it comes to organizing to address issues in your building, who can fix the issues? It's always going to be your landlord. And your landlord is always going to be your primary target. There might be secondary targets. There might be other people to put pressure on, or other people to think about. But your landlord is going to be your target. And then the question becomes, okay, we know what the issue is. We've got our demands, and we know we want our landlord to fix the issue. How do we get them to do this? If our landlords wanted to maintain our buildings or not evict us or not make the rent so high, they would do that, right? They're behaving the way that they're behaving because that's the way they want to behave. So what we have to do as tenants is work together to put pressure on them through action to get them to address the issues or meet our demands. I think also, like, it goes without saying that at this point, if people are organizing a tenant association to address maintenance issues, they've already brought these issues to the landlord's attention. They've already, asked for things to get fixed, and they're not getting fixed, and that's why people will come together as a group. So typically, people have asked nicely already, or they've tried to get things done on their own, and that's not working because their landlord doesn't feel any pressure to, or they're not motivated to. So the way to get them to address these issues is to use our collective power to put pressure on them. Similarly, if they apply for an AGI, they know what they're doing. They know that rents are already unaffordable, and in fact, they might be applying for the AGI in order to push people out. If they give you eviction notices, they know that you're not going to be happy about that. So like I said, the primary target is always going to be your landlord. And as tenants, we can collectively work to increase the pressure on the target to meet our demands. Now, there's different types of landlords. There's nonprofit landlords, corporate landlords, REITs. There's some smaller landlords. Sometimes there's landlords that own one building. Sometimes there's landlords that own hundreds of buildings. different landlords present different opportunities, present different possibilities for action, and present secondary targets. Sometimes there's going to be a owner of the building and a property management company as well. So for example, Briar Lane is a property management company that manages buildings for a lot of smaller landlords or landlords who might only own one building or a few buildings. Starlight, which is one of the biggest landlords in the country, they own buildings, but they hire property managers like Greenwind, Cogier, Metcalf, DMS. And then there's some companies like Greenwind that sometimes they manage buildings for others and sometimes they own the buildings themselves. At different times and depending on the issue, you might start by bringing your concerns or targeting the property management company. At other times, you might go straight to the owner on the building. It really depends on the issue and the situation and how you want to escalate things. If it's a maintenance issue at a building, often the first step might be bringing the concerns to the property management company, but that's really up to you and your neighbors. One thing that's important to keep in mind, no matter who your landlord is, no matter what type of landlord, whether it's nonprofit, a corporate, an individual, there's always people behind these companies, and these people typically own other buildings or have other businesses. People have homes, they have business associates, they care about their public reputations, they have investors who they have to keep happy. They sit on the boards of nonprofits. There are people just like us behind these companies, and these people have interests that can be targeted. Secondary targets are just going to be people that or organizations that tenants can put pressure on, so that the secondary targets put pressure on the landlord in order to meet our demands. So if you are trying to plan a campaign to target your landlord, to put pressure on them to address an issue or meet your demands, you're going to want to know your landlord. Information about your landlord is really, really important. So I'm not going to read all the questions that are up on the screen, but basically you want to know, is my landlord an individual? Do they own other buildings? Do they have other businesses? Is it a big company? Is there a pension fund behind the landlord? You want to find out as much as you can about the owner of your building, the people involved in that ownership, and as much as you can about those individuals, because that information is power. That information is going to help you plan actions to put pressure on them. So do a lot of research about your landlord. If you don't know who your landlord is already, you can find out who owns your building from the City of Toronto assessment rolls. These are available, I believe. For a while, you couldn't go to City Hall because of COVID restrictions, but you should be able to go now. So these are available for free to look at. You can look up your address. It'll tell you who owns the building according to property assessments. One shortcoming here is that these are only updated annually. So if a building's recently sold, it won't be reflected in the assessment rolls. Another way to find out who owns your building without going to City Hall and to get updated information is by looking it up in the land registry. So you could do this through, unfortunately, they privatized their land registry. So you have to go through a company called Tenant, and it costs about $30 to do a property search. But you could basically search your address or the address of your building through Tenant, and that will tell you who owns the building. Now, sometimes it's going to turn up an individual's name or a couple of individuals. Sometimes it's going to be a numbered company or some other corporation like, 1 Queen Street Inc. If that is the only information you have and you really don't know who the people are behind this company, you could do a corporate profile search. Again, this is unfortunately something that's been privatized, but there are certain services that are online that you could pay for. So ESC is one, OnCorp is another. And you could basically run a corporate profile search to find out who the directors of the company that owns your building are. Now, this is only for people who don't already know who their landlord is. A lot of big corporate landlords advertise their identities so we know who they are. But sometimes a lot of smaller buildings, but even some bigger buildings, especially in the inner suburbs in Toronto and in other cities, you might not know who owns the building. So these are tools you could use in order to find out. Obviously, the City of Toronto assessment rolls is only going to be for buildings in the city, but the land registry and the corporate profiles would be Ontario-wide. You could get that information. A good resource is landlordsoftoronto.com. It's got good information about some of the major landlords in the city. So, you know, your Starlights, Metcalf, stuff like that. So those are situations where you might know who owns the building, but you might not know much about these people. So there's some information there about, you know, the people behind the companies, other buildings that are owned by the same landlord. And another useful thing to do to gather information is to search individuals online and on social media. Not all landlords have big online presences, but a lot of them do. And that could give you some useful information for, you know, learning more about their interests and how you could kind of target those in your campaign. So you've got your demands. Let's say it's getting maintenance done, and you not only know who your landlord is, but you've got a bunch of information about them. So how do you get your landlord to do what you want, to meet your demands? Like I said already, you know, if they wanted to, they would have, you know, already done it. If they wanted to maintain your apartment, they would come do the repairs when you ask them nicely. If they wanted you to stay in your home, they wouldn't give you that eviction notice, or they would have, you know, dealt with you appropriately when you raise concerns to them directly. So, you know, if we're thinking about collective action and we're organizing together, it's because, you know, we've already hit that wall, and our landlord seems, you know, intent on not meeting our demands. So that's why we're coming together as a group, and we could put pressure on our landlord through collective action. So this is where the tenant association stuff comes in. You know, the power you have as tenants is going to depend on your numbers as a group, but also your unity. So how much you know, participate, how much you stick together, how much the people in the tenant association are committed to the organizing efforts. You know, your landlord, if they're not doing repairs and they're ignoring your request, they're not going to be concerned if you know, one or two people bring the demand to them. Even if you call yourselves a tenant association, they're not going to be too concerned. But if lots of tenants are involved in the organizing and are willing to you know, engage in actions and engage in escalating actions, then this can become a headache for your landlord. It's sometimes tenants are able to you know, put costs on our landlords, whether it's financial costs, social costs, personal costs, in order to force them to reconsider whether they want to change their behavior. So that's what we're doing when we're taking collective action to put pressure on our landlords. So what are some actions? And some of these are kind of like roughly in escalating order. A good first action might be a collective demand letter delivery. So you might put together a collective letter, you know, demanding your landlord do the maintenance, attach a bunch of maintenance forms. Everyone in the building signs it, and then you deliver it as a group, either to the office, the landlord's office, or even at their home. I think, you know, typically we're going to want our actions to escalate. We're going to want to give the landlord a chance, even if we're organizing. We're going to want to be firm. But, you know, depending on the situation, it might not make sense to immediately go on rent strike. It's up to you. If that's something you and your neighbors want to do, then go for it. But sometimes it might be good to, within reason, you know, start by putting your landlord on notice, delivering a demand letter, whether to the office or their home, depends on the situation, depends on what you think is warranted. And then maybe go from there. I think, you know, you don't want to necessarily get too cute and have like a million different escalating actions until you finally get to where you want to go. You're going to want to be flexible. You're going to want to make decisions as a group to think, you discuss what makes sense in the context, what makes sense based on how your landlord has responded. But it could be useful as a general rule in most situations to think about, escalating actions. So a demand letter is a good first step, sorry. There's other actions, let's say at the landlord's office, other businesses or their home. You could do a protest there. You could flyer their neighborhood. You could flyer their business community, put up posters. Another way to put pressure on your landlord is to start reaching out to tenants in other buildings owned by the same landlord. Often, if you're a Starlight tenant dealing with certain issues, chances are lots of other Starlight tenants are facing the same issues. So if you have some solid organizing established in your building and you're engaged in a campaign against your landlord, it might make sense to try to flyer some neighboring buildings owned by Starlight as well, and see if you could get some other tenants organizing to help, build your power, make your group bigger, get more attention, put a little bit more pressure on your landlord by getting more people involved. It's not always necessary strategy. It's also not always effective, but it's something that's available. Another way to organize is kind of at the neighborhood level. So reaching out to other buildings in your neighborhood who might be experiencing the same thing, who might have experienced it in the past, who might experience it in the future, and see if they'll support you and your neighbors in your fight, with the understanding that you'll support them in the future. It's often there's certain benefits to organizing with other tenants who have the same landlord, but there are certain benefits to organizing with tenants who are in your neighborhood. And sometimes even if you have different landlords, there are ways that your neighbors might be able to support you that someone across the city can't. So sometimes that could be helpful for your organizing or for your campaign. Another thing tenants often do is a phone or email zap to put pressure on their landlord. And like I said, going on rent strike, withholding a portion of your rent, those are also tools the tenants have used with success in Toronto, whether it's rent increases, evictions, getting repairs done, stuff like that. But really, these are just examples. What opportunities are available in your particular situation is really going to depend on your landlord. For example, if your landlord's a nonprofit landlord, there might be ways to put pressure on them that a corporate landlord might not be sensitive to. If you live in Toronto community housing, there might be ways to put pressure on that organization that are different than what you might do for a REIT, for example. The structure of the company that you're targeting, their particular interests, their particular vulnerabilities, those are all things to take into account when you're organizing. I think I already covered this, but just a couple of important things to keep in mind. Your landlord needs to know that you're the one that's doing this and that what you're doing is linked to your demands. And that's why, for example, a demand letter is often a good first step, because it puts the landlord on notice that, these are our concerns and we're going to take action if you don't meet our demands. When you're planning actions, sometimes people want to have a rally in their neighborhood. Sometimes that could be effective for getting media attention. Sometimes that could be effective for getting neighbors in your community to support your struggle, but sometimes those aren't terribly affected because your landlord doesn't find out about them and doesn't really care. Now, like I said, you might be having a rally in your neighborhood to get community support or to get media attention. That's fine, but if your primary objective for specific action, let's say, is putting pressure on your landlord, then you have to think about whether your landlord is going to notice your action and whether they're going to know that it's linked to your demands. Another thing to keep in mind, it's important to understand who's an ally and who is not an ally. Media could be helpful, but reporters often have their own interests as well. Politicians are often going to present themselves as allies, but it's important to really think critically about whether your political representatives are actually allies in your struggle. Often, especially it's campaign season now in Toronto for the municipal election, politicians have a lot more, typically politicians have a lot more to gain by aligning themselves with tenants, then tenants gain from aligning themselves with politicians. So just make sure that you and your neighbors are, thinking critically about who's an ally in your fight and who might not be. Media could be helpful. Often media could help amplify actions, help bring attention to a situation. Um, I think sometimes there's a bit of a misconception. People think that, oh, if we just get some media attention, then the issue will be resolved. Sometimes that works, but very often, media attention alone is not going to resolve the issue. So you're not going to want to kind of depend on the media attention. But another reason you're not going to want to depend on it is because you don't have control over whether or not a reporter covers your story. At the same time, when tenants do organize, you could do actions that are effective even without media attention. And often tenants find that it's only when they take collective action, when they do something, that the media pays attention. So media could be useful, but I wouldn't structure your organizing around it or structure your campaign around it or rely on it too much. Similarly, social media can be useful. But I think, again, we sometimes overestimate the impact of social media. Just posting, something on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, it's not necessarily going to shame your landlord into, doing the right thing. They might not see it, they might not care. So just posting pictures of disrepair is not necessarily a way to get things fixed. In the context of a campaign, it could be effective. But typically just posting things on social media is not going to result in issues being resolved. Yeah, so I think just, thinking of social media as a complement to your organizing is a good way to think about it. It could help sometimes get media attention, could help connect you to other tenant groups or other tenants or supporters who might want to support a phone zap or come out to a rally. But it isn't a substitute for organizing or for taking collective direct action. And that's it.